Hi, my name is Tom Manning. I'm a chemistry professor at Valdosta State University. This is a presentation for the ACS meeting in Boston, Massachusetts in August of 2015. It is entitled Retracing Footsteps and Developing New Contacts. It's about my 15-year interaction with faculty and students in Cuba. And I apologize for not being there in person. I had a family situation. Thank you. This is a brief outline of the talk. I'd like to give a little background on both my family and my wife's family and their relation to Cuba. Talk a little bit about some of the early motivation I had to go to Cuba revolving around marine natural products. I'd like to talk about a couple of chemical education exercises we did as a collaborative exercise. Talk about a book that we co-authored with faculty member and student authors from Havana, Cuba, and then maybe project into some future research and education endeavors that we tried to kick off in years past, but we didn't get far, but maybe now the timing is better. My wife, her maiden name is Arlene Ronaldos. Her grandfather's family comes from Matanzas outside Havana. So early on in our relationship there was, a little bit of Cuban history. Her grandfather moved here in the late 1930s. And set in New York, not far from where my family lived, although we ended up meeting in Florida. And you can see the baby she's holding there is who I'm taking to college this weekend. My first trip to Cuba took place in the summer of 2001. We left Miami and flew to Havana. We left from the corner of the Miami airport that I guess you couldn't see on any of the normal departure times or dates. And then Havana, we came into a smaller airport, not the main airport, that was more, seemed like a service type airport. But I spent close to 3 weeks during that trip circling the country. I mean, we went from Havana down to Santiago, where we spent time on the north and the south coast, as well as a number of inland cities. One of the intriguing places I went to was called Las Tunas, which wasn't far from Santiago, in the southeast corner of Cuba. During our trip to Cuba, we saw many of the typical Cuban sites, such as a large number of old American cars that I think was a credit to Cuban ingenuity, that they could keep them running for 50 years after auto parts stopped going to the island. They ate a much healthier diet than they did in the U.S., a lot of basic protein like chicken and fish, and then fruits and vegetables. On the lower left, you see the Ozone Research Center in Havana. We had hoped to visit it there, but we're unable to schedule a visit. They use ozone in healthcare. In the lower right, you can see a shrimp farm on the south coast of Cuba. Those two last places are of interest to us because we were doing work with ozone and shrimp aquaculture, knocking back viral and bacterial infections. On a personal level, one of the more interesting places I visited in 2001 was a town called Las Tunas, located between Camagüey and Holguin, and roughly between the north and the south shore going towards Santiago. My father had been there in the late 1940s. He was a Marine, enlisted at the age of 17, right at the end of World War II. Was in San Diego ready to deploy. The war ended. They shipped him back east. He spent a year in North Carolina, and then went down and spent 2.5 years in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay area. His role was more as someone that went out and procured fresh water, procured different types of food, and I believe then it was a friendlier time. You can see him sitting on a bench in the upper left-hand corner with several Cuban youths. You notice the boy with the T-shirt on, second from the left, with the brownish hair and kind of has a smaller child on him. I'll come back to him in a moment. In the lower left-hand corner is a man named Johnny Melko. He's the taller gentleman. He also was a Marine and stationed in Guantanamo. His family left Armenia roughly 1910 to 1920. Half of them went to Boston, Massachusetts, or Worcester area. The other half went to Las Tunas. So when he was in Guantanamo, he got a chance to visit relatives in Las Tunas and brought my dad with him on a couple of these these visits. These are two pictures of the town square in Las Tunas. The upper left-hand corner, I took that in 2001. In the lower right-hand corner, my father took that in 1947, 1948 during one of his trips there. You can see that a lot of the, the well-built stone buildings are still there. Something very interesting happened in the square when we were there. I had brought roughly 24 color pictures my father took of Las Tunas. Most of them had relatives of Johnny Melko in them, and they were about 8.5 by 11. We had them blown up, and we went into the town square, and you can see the upper left-hand corner, some of the old guys sitting around, and we started to pass these around. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see Johnny Melko again with his arm around a small boy, and you can see that small boy directly below him. He's the older man holding up the picture. This is in the kind of a town hall. It was a government building, which was also kind of a quasi-museum that had a lot of old pictures. One of the odd things that we found about a lot of the small towns in Cuba was that many people did not have pictures of their family. And when we went into the town square with these 24 pictures, a lot of people were looking at aunts and uncles and cousins, a number of whom had passed away and they hadn't had any kind of visualization of in decades. And that's what this man right here is doing. We ended up donating those 24 pictures to the people in the government building, and then we sent this man his own copy. And then we were given a certificate of donation. So an interesting human event that kind of connected the generations for my family. My father did end up writing a book called Swans Are Calling, and it was about being on a large plantation near Santiago in the 1940s. It was never published. He did have another book published called Blue Invective that was published by Bobbs and Merrill. But this particular one did end up in some kind of book list, and it was cited as one of the few historical documents outlining life in rural Cuba in the late 1940s in that particular area. So if anybody would like a copy of it, please let me know. I'd be happy to mail you some. One of the things that initially drew me to Cuba was the pristine coastline, particularly along the southern coast. A lot of our group's research involves marine natural products. A lot of times this involves harvesting things like different types of invertebrates, jellyfish, etc., and then looking for drugs that are manufactured by bacteria that are symbiotic with the marine organism as a defense mechanism. We thought that the Cuban coast would be, a great place to look. At the time, we were developing a concept we call pharmaceutical aquaculture, and that's where we would take marine sediment, treat it with a specific type of nutrient, get the bacteria to grow out, and then we look at that particular bacteria to see if there was any existing drugs that were very expensive to make, such as bryostatin, which comes from a marine organism called Bugula narentina, or if there might be some new structures in there. This is a group of students working with me. We're in the Florida Keys on a flat looking for invertebrates. In particular, we're looking for a sea squirt called Ectocidium turbinata. It contains a drug called ET743 and has the trade name Yondelis. A lot of times you find these growing on rocks or some human factors like a crab cage. A lot of the environment in the Florida Keys and the Cuban coast have a lot of similarities. So far, we've had a total of 9 cancer drugs into preclinical trials, 5 antibiotics into preclinical trials at NIH, and we've been working on some known drugs such as the Alzheimer's HIV drug called bryostatin that currently costs about $15 million a gram, and we're working on a way of trying to synthesize it in the ocean by farming the ocean. Florida Keys are very well developed, lots of hotels, lots of restaurants everywhere you go, a lot of boats, a lot of human traffic on the beaches. So maybe not so pristine, we're after bacteria, so there's all sorts of other bacteria that come out of septic tanks that can be a product of runoff from nitrates and phosphates from golf courses and lawns, etc. So Cuba may be the last great place in the Caribbean to do this type of work. So let me tell you about our first chemical education exercise. I really had hoped to do something with marine natural products, but in my different visits there, the idea of collecting samples and then bringing them back to the United States seemed to be a difficult thing to do. So this one was called the Electronic Qualitative Analysis Schemes. It's something that we came up with. We published a small education paper on it, on the kind of the logistics behind it. But it was a group of students at Valdosta State and a group of students in Havana in the lab of Dr. Aurora Perez Gramatis. Participated. It was a Saturday. I had maybe 40 to 45 general chemistry students participate. I think Aurora's students were a little more specialized. And long story short, it was an exercise in Excel. Lasted several hours, and then we completed it. Wrote a small paper on it. So I guess good for diplomacy. Students got an opportunity to learn a little bit of chemistry. And, it kind of put us on our way to collaborate on chemical education activities. This exercise took place some 8 years ago, and it did draw a little bit of local press, I believe, on both sides of the Florida Straits. The next academic exercise or educational exercise that we participated in was a periodic puzzle competition. And this is kind of a Sudoku goes chemistry. A lot of riddles involved in it, more so than your normal Sudoku. We broadcasted it internationally. I think we had 6 or 7 countries represented and several dozen teams, a majority of which were from Cuba and the United States. We announced it in advance. It took place on a Saturday. There were a set of rules for not only the periodic puzzles, but for also how the competition would be run. You had different age groups, middle school, high school, college, post-college. So it was part of National Chemistry Week. We had it within a relatively close proximity to that. Periodic puzzles was something that we developed, and we published a small chemical education exercise on it that has varying levels of difficulty. It does involve the symbols in the periodic table, but it's more based on periodic trends. So there are various levels of difficulty. Some of the groups weren't able to finish one, and I believe we turned out something like 8 to 10 for each of the groups. The contest went well. It lasted all day. It took a few days to grade the winning or to grade the competition. We gave a first, second, and third place in each of the divisions. And so we consider it a success. Both of our sides worked well together, even though it was a kind of a small activity. The contest went well. It lasted all day. It took a few days to grade the winning or to grade the competition. We gave a first, second, and third place in each of the divisions. And so we consider it a success. Both of our sides worked well together, even though it was a kind of a small activity. Let me tell you about another project that Aurora and I completed. Inside this book there are several student co-authors that helped with specific chapters. It's based on computational chemistry, right? There's a lot of molecular modeling in it, natural products, nanotubes, fullerenes, single molecule magnets, things of that nature. There's also a bunch of Excel exercises. So this is meant to be used in an undergraduate chemistry curriculum to enhance computer skills and to do some exercises on computer, which is obviously hit mainstream in chemistry in general. That said, I don't think Aurora or I would argue that the world absolutely positively needed another chemistry textbook. but it was something that we could do together as a collaborative effort between, a Cuban teacher and an American teacher. We did find a publisher for it. It's sold as an ebook. I'll talk about some of the chapters in a minute. There were some logistical problems with this. I mean, as I mentioned previously, Cuba is one of the most internet-limited countries in the Western Hemisphere. So us going back and forth on this, often there were built-in delays that you might not have if I was doing it, say, with another American or a Canadian. We published a Spanish version of the book. That was done on Aurora's end, obviously. I'm not fluent in Spanish. And so we have the English published version, but there's also a Spanish version out there that we posted on the web. It can be purchased. One of the interesting things that came out of this is, although we didn't expect to make big bucks, obviously, was when the royalties came, how would you send a royalty check from an American publishing company to a Cuban scientist? Aurora now has a place in Brazil, so I think if that does come up, it's no longer an issue. As an example of some of the chapters, you can see the first one listed, bonds and forces, nitrogen and nanotubes. This replicates, using computational methods, some of the interactions that different atoms and molecules have with each other. The second one is an Excel exercise, nuclear stability belt, which students study in general chemistry. The third one is also an Excel exercise, doing a lot of calculations with speciations as a function of pH. The fourth one is building the single molecule magnets, which are also called quantum computers, Mn12 and iron 8. These actually can be pretty difficult to do. They look very easy in a flat 2D dimension, but when you go to 3D, they're much harder. The next one is ozone decomposition kinetics, where, again, this can be a freshman chemistry exercise or even a physical chemistry exercise, depends upon how much interpretation you want from the results, in which students do 0, first, second, third, fourth order plots for some experimental data from ozone concentration versus time. The next one is just 30 equations that students see in general chemistry, and it has a small Excel exercise with each one. This ranges from thermodynamics to kinetics to stoichiometry to a little bit of nuclear. And then the last one is another radioactivity exercise demonstrating first order kinetics. So these are just an example of about the 25 chapters that are in there. They're roughly split between computational, in which we use Spartan, which is produced by Wavefunction in California, and then Excel, which is in the Microsoft package. And it gives students step-by-step on how to do each of these. I'd like to read the letter that Roberto Chow, president of the Cuban Chemical Society, who may be in the audience, wrote for the book. Chemistry is based on experimental facts, which in this century are determined by more and more complicated techniques. In this sense, computers are unavoidable for processing experimental data. Nevertheless, the principles and methodology for experimental work remain valid. At first sight, the methodology used in the determination and use of parameters seem to be something of no interest and importance. That sin is paid at a very high price. Fortunately, books like this may save many souls. And this book has been written so well with such a practical approach that permits students interested in chemistry to learn easily the way to work with experimental data in order to use them fully, something extremely important in modern science. The most important topics of modern chemistry are analyzed by the authors from an experimental point of view. Topics that go from molecular structure to acidity to nanotechnology and radioactivity have been treated in a very fine way. Practically nothing nowadays important is missing. Direct relations between these topics and our daily life have been didactically established as a way to stimulate the interest of the readers. I am sure that the students will enjoy reading and using the book as I did. For teachers, this book constitutes an excellent didactic instrument. And then the last paragraph, interestingly, the authors, both excellent chemists and teachers, are from two countries geographically close, but so far away for other reasons, something that could not become an unsolvable obstacle for them. Hopefully this foreword, written by Roberto just a few years ago, is starting to we're starting to see a fruition for it, come to fruition. Well, finally, let me say that one of the things I've tried to do on a couple of occasions with Cuba is to take a class there. What we didn't want to do was to stay in a hotel, and eat hotel food, because that would price most of our students out of it, and it would limit it. We inquired about a trip maybe traveling around Cuba, much like, say, people may travel around Europe and stay at hostels. When I travel with classes, we typically stay in tents. We camp. Every year we have a 9-day trip to the Florida Keys, and in the Florida Keys, we camp for 9 nights. Students eat out, keeps the cost down. Maybe sometime, hopefully in the near future, I can take a class to Cuba, and I can take 10, 12, 15 junior and senior chemistry majors, and we hike, take a train and a bus, and do the same route I did back in 2001, where we circle Cuba. When we do these trips, they're not really touristy. Every day we have a field trip, or we make a series of measurements. For example, one day we may spend 24 hours measuring a whole bunch of ocean parameters, pH, DO, nitrates, phosphates, salinity, at a specific location, and plot them versus tide height and temperature and things like that. The next day we may visit a research center and then have to do a paper. For example, we may go to Dolphin Research Center, and then that night the students have to put together a small presentation or write a paper on sonar. So there's a lot of chemistry to be learned just by being tourists and hitting different spots. This is something I always wanted to do with Cuba because the country's safe. Right? When I was there was virtually no crime in terms of guns or drugs, the kind of things that might limit you in certain areas of the U.S., although most areas it's not a problem. And there's also a lot of natural beauty, and we always found the people to be very warm and open. So maybe if I'm going to project, let me project that one of my class trips in the near future, will be kind of a budget trip where myself and 12 of my students hike around Cuba for 3 or 4 weeks and get to know every detail about the coastline that we can learn in that time. Some chemistry, some marine science, and, just some humanity. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to give this talk, and I hope all the other presentations go well. Thank you.